there was a piece in 2007, I believe, by Anatole Levin that made the case that pushing NATO expansion could force us into a new Cold War with Russia. 2007, right?
Much think.
Exactly. I know. I read that, and it was literally like it could have been written, a year ago.
Yeah.
And here we are in a really precarious situation with Russia and Ukraine. But I think if you look back to those conversations that we wanted to reignite, it's really a lot of the issues that are driving our politics right now. We were somewhat ahead of our time. I mentioned foreign policy. That first editorial also talks about the challenges of assimilation. When you have unchecked immigration coming into this country, you don't take the challenge of assimilation seriously, you're going to have a lot of problems. We're seeing that now. Political economy, right? We said that we would question the benefits and point to the pitfalls of the global free trade economy. That's only been exacerbated over the past 20 years. And then just sort of a robust defense of American culture, of faith and family, of really, I think, the bedrock of any worthwhile conservatism. We felt that too often got short shifts in conservative politics. So that was a lot of the impetus behind the magazine. Launched in 2002 with Iraq Folly on the cover, and it's been a good 20 years since.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week, and really for the rest of the season, it's just going to be me. You see here, as of this episode's release, Nick and his wife Evie are due tomorrow. And so they are on much needed leave, and Nick is still going to be helping out with all things American Moment. Ship wouldn't run without him, but he will not be taping the rest of the season with me. But fear not, we're going to have fantastic episodes all the way through to the very end, including today's episode, which is with Emile Doak, the executive director of the American Ideas Institute, which publishes the American Conservative, one of the few magazines worth a damn. Look, when we launched our organization, we had a choice. We could have done the standard thing, which is publish our launch op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or National Review or one of these other publications. We've had friends that have launched in the Federalist before, and there would have been pros and cons to all of those, a lot of cons, but we thought that there was only one place that was worth putting our launch op-ed in. It was titled We Must Build an Elite for This American Moment, and we published it in the American Conservative because it has been right from the beginning. The American Conservative is celebrating 20 years of being correct and forthright and honest about issues ranging from immigration to foreign policy to culture to family to trade and more, and we think it's extremely important to honor them in that way. They're still publishing awesome stuff today. Micah Meadowcroft over there, who edits their website, Helen Andrews, who edits the magazine, all the junior staff, they're all great people. Some of them are our people. We made those recommendations, but so we're definitely biased, but we just love the place. And so Emil and I got to sit down and have a long conversation about the history of the American Conservative and how he thinks about the world. It's a fun, interesting episode. Hopefully you'll listen through to the end, and hopefully you'll join us and the American Conservative for their 20th anniversary gala. It will be on November 17th. We are co-sponsors on it, and so we'll hope to see you there. Go to theamericanconservative.com in order to find all the information about that. But to finish out Emil's formal bio, he is the executive director of the American Ideas Institute, which publishes the American Conservative. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, where he studied political philosophy and theology, and previously worked in education before returning to the field of his studies. His writing has appeared in First Things, from Porch Republic, Chronicles, a magazine of American culture, and elsewhere. He is a proud Virginian, as he will relentlessly tell you, and him and his wife live in the historic district of their hometown, Herndon. We'll go now to Emile Doak. Emile, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
It feels like it's been a long time coming. It shouldn't have taken 80 episodes, but there's an august occasion in the coming days. That is to say, the 20th anniversary of the American Conservative. And I want to hear, much like we often hear about our guests, the entire history of the magazine. But I want to hear about your history first. How did you end up at the point where you are the executive director of the only magazine that's been worth a damn, I think, for the last 20 years or so? Tell us the tale.
Yeah, pure luck. It's called failing up. I believe.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of that.
Yes, no, exactly. So I'm from Herndon, Virginia. It's the first thing people should know about me. I love my hometown. Very still rooted in that
you
place.
have like Texan levels of if no one asks, you'll mention it anyway.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. It's on my bio and everything. And I actually think it's really important politically, which we can return to as well. But no, I grew up there. It's, a suburb of DC. I always like to say that it is its own town in its own right. It's not just another crappy suburb of the swamp. But that was how I got my start. And then I went to Georgetown to study political philosophy in college. I did the whole DC thing.
So you lived in the deep state, and then you went to the deep state school.
Yes. Yes. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I did the whole DC thing, did internships, AEI, a couple other political places around town. And
how many of your previous employers would disavow you now?
That is a good question. You'll have to ask them.
Yeah.
But really just got kind of burnt out on the whole thing. And so when I was graduating college, I had my political philosophy degree, political theory degree. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was really thinking about two tracks. One was just continuing to do the whole political thing in DC. And two was teaching. I thought it'd be kind of cool to be like a small town teacher and coach and whatever and just do that. Mm-hmm. So I was pursuing both of those tracks, ended up with an opportunity to teach at a small test prep firm because that was the only place that would hire me. I didn't have a teaching degree or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And an opportunity to join the Federalist Society as well as like a sort of like entry-level development guy. For a couple of reasons, I chose the teaching gig. One was that, again, I was just kind of burnt out on the DC thing and I wanted to explore something different. And two is that it paid better. And I was getting married young. I was one of those irresponsible people who gets married right out of college.
Yeah. Your high school sweetheart, right?
Yeah, elementary school, actually.
Elementary school.
That's why I'm so wedded to Herndon, Virginia. I mean, that's where everything happened for me. So yeah, I took the teaching job. I did that for about 3 years. It was fun. I mean, I really like working with students, with high schoolers. It's a fun time in life. But that also got burnt out on that pretty quickly as well for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, it's test prep, right? So like you see the worst of
the modern education system.
Yes. And especially in DC. I mean, you're dealing with like the elite of DC private schools. Didn't love that. Dealing with the parents was the worst part. And then two, it was the Trump era, right? This was 2015 or so. And I just couldn't figure out what this Trump moment was about. I'd always been a conservative. And I will admit that I was late to Trump. At first, I was like, who is this, thrice married New York businessman? Yeah. And why are all these social conservatives flocking to him? And the more that I watched it and the more that I saw his success, I got really, really interested in it. And I wanted to be part of that. So yeah, that was about the time that the American Conservative, which I've been reading for a while, was looking for a director of events and outreach. I loved the magazine. I was like, I'll do whatever, like events.
When did you first discover the magazine?
In college. Okay. So yeah, I studied at Georgetown with some really great professors, Patrick Deneen, Father James Shaw, Josh Mitchell. And that was sort of my entry to the magazine. Deneen especially been writing for them. So yeah, I discovered the magazine and it really spoke to a lot of the conservatism that I sort of intuitively had. So yeah, around 2017, I had the opportunity to join the magazine and been there since.
And so you started out as a director of events and outreach and then immediately up to executive director?
That's how we do things at TAC.
That's powerful stuff.
No, I had a number of different roles there. I did the event stuff for a while. I moved over to the fundraising side, did some programmatic stuff. And then when Johnny Burkham, my predecessor, now took over at ISI, the board did a search and landed on me.
Very cool. So let's talk about the American Conservative. I think it's very interesting because it, in many different ways, but one of the reasons why is because most of the mainstays of the quote-unquote conservative movement, which I've taken to arguing is neither, were founded in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, sometimes in the 80s. But this is a product of the 2000s. Walk me through that moment, story that TAC tells about why it came to exist in the halcyon days of, I'm looking at one of the issues here on the table, October 7th, 2002.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy to think back to that. I mean, a lot of what we've been doing this year for the 20th anniversary is looking back at those early days, and it's been incredible to look at. So basically, our three founders, Pat Buchanan, who viewers should probably know at this point, Scott McConnell was our first editor, and Taki, long Greek last name, the businessman.
Theodorakopoulos.
Yes, the odd couple. Really felt that the conservative movement hadn't really conserved much for far too long. It's explicitly written in the first editorial of that first issue sitting here on the desk that the magazine wanted to reignite conversations that conservatives had neglected for far too long, at least since the end of the Cold War. So chief among them was Iraq, right? This was the build up to the Iraq War. The very first issue said Iraq folly on the cover. That didn't win us many friends on the right of center in Washington at that time. But we really felt that we needed to recalibrate.
Were you guys one of the unpatriotic conservatives?
Oh, yeah. No, that was like 100% about attack. I mean, that was like the response to the American conservative.
Yeah.
Unpatriotic conservatives.
Was that piece actually published like very shortly after the magazine launched?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Wow.
David from National Review, Unpatriotic Conservatives.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was Pat Buchanan, Scott McConnell. All those guys were the quote unquote unpatriotic conservatives. Buchanan's surefire flop came from New Republic. So we weren't received very well at the time. But I think if you look back to those conversations that we wanted to reignite, it's really a lot of the issues that are driving our politics right now. We were somewhat ahead of our time. I mentioned foreign policy. That first editorial also talks about the challenges of assimilation. When you have unchecked immigration coming into this country, you don't take the challenge of assimilation seriously, you're going to have a lot of problems. We're seeing that now. Political economy, right? We said that we would question the benefits and point to the pitfalls of the global free trade economy. That's only been exacerbated over the past 20 years. And then just sort of a robust defense of American culture, of faith and family, of really, I think, the bedrock of any worthwhile conservatism. We felt that too often got short shifts in conservative politics. So that was a lot of the impetus behind the magazine. Launched in 2002 with Iraq folly on the cover, and it's been a good 20 years since.
What was that time like being, in the, I guess, 6 final years of the Bush administration, being a conservative publication completely at odds with the sitting Republican president? It's a tense place to be. The Weekly Standard experience to touch of that, I assume, during the early Trump years. What was that like? I mean, obviously you're speaking through inherited memory.
Yeah, I'm grateful for those who fought those fights, because I was 13 at the time.
I'm assuming there's blood stains on the back of the couches at the TAC office and whatever from back in the day. But what was that like?
I mean, we were completely written out of the conservative movement, right? I mean, I mentioned the initial reactions with surefire flop and unpatriotic conservatives, but it meant that we needed to make a lot of friends in unlikely places, right? So if you look at the people who were against the Iraq War at that time, obviously you had many people on the left. I think it's really interesting to see in the context of Russia-Ukraine how the left-wing anti-war movement has like basically disappeared. What happened? So we kind of opened up our pages sometimes to heterodox left of center thinkers, a lot of libertarians, right? I mean, huge credit to Ron Paul for waking up a lot of people to the failure that was Iraq in 2008. But yeah, I mean, it's a strange position to be in when you are sort of a gadfly rather than in the heart of the movement. And I think there's a lot of lessons there. Now, one of the things I would say too is now, in the Trump moment, things have totally shifted. And a lot of those policies that were completely written out of the movement in the 2000s, I mean, the Republican Party today looks a lot more like Pat Buchanan's vision than it does George W. Bush's. So that's also been something that we've needed to navigate is, just dispositionally changing from that gadfly who's on the outs to actually being in the movement now.
Yeah. What do you make of the analogies between the Republican Party that Pat Buchanan was trying to make and the one that Donald Trump made? Because I think as much as we often talk about the similarities, there are real differences, I think largely as a consequence of history, also because they're two very different men. How do you compare and contrast what it is that they stood for?
I still go back to, I can't remember what year it was as recently that Matthew Walter wrote that Barstool Conservatives piece, right? And that is always sort of my concern with the Trump moment, is that it can too easily be co-opted on the social conservative side into Barstool conservatism. For me personally, my politics is primarily social conservative first. I think a lot of these other issues stem from that. If we're not actually conserving these bedrock institutions of faith and family, what the heck are we doing, right? And I do think, especially just looking at the two men, Buchanan versus Trump. Look, I love Trump. I think he's great. But they're two very different styles of approaching a social conservative politics. So that is the one thing that gives me pause. And I still am wrestling with how to process the whole Barstool Conservatives thing. And so I think there's a lot that still needs to be worked out there for the current moment.
It's interesting because holding affirmatively social conservative views versus the role that personal behavior plays in public life has always been an interesting tension, right? Because, when we think of someone like David French would use the personal behavior of a candidate or a public figure as an indictment of the quality of their social conservative advocacy. This is the traditional argument made against Trump, but it could also be made against a bunch of other figures that potentially, or essential to the flourishing of the right in the places where it's done well. How do you navigate that tension of, an audience for a magazine is typically older people, it's typically, more personally conservative people, recognizing the limitations of public figures?
We ran a piece, I think it was last fall, I believe it was triple bylined, from Saurabh Amari, Gladden Papin, Chad Pecknold, I believe, making basically this point, looking especially to a lot of the politicians in Europe who are espousing a very public Christianity, a very political Christianity, and their personal lives are a total wreck. Mm-hmm. And I completely take their point that, like, ultimately, we just want good policies enacted, right? And I do think that for too long, the American conservative movement has been really preoccupied with the piousness or lack thereof of our political leaders. But I guess I do think, though, that at the end of the day, for better or for worse, people are going to look at these mm-hmm. people as role models. And on the whole, it's probably better to have somebody who I would want my kids to take after than not.
Right. Variously, during the American conservatives' history, you guys have often had the tagline "principles over party." How much of the opportunities that exist on the right today do you think are because Trump was largely a restrained president and Biden hasn't been, and so the opportunities for traditional partisan polarization are aligned in a way that is beneficial to TAC, versus if you're 2 years into a Republican president, sorry, if the Republican president is bad on foreign policy, then you're getting a bad Republican Party on foreign policy? Or do you think something's permanently changed?
Well, you mean it's better for us now that there's a Democrat in the White House? Or?
How much of the shifts are fragile? How much of the shifts are fragile because we have a hawkish Democratic president right after a fairly restrained Republican president?
I mean, I actually think that, especially what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, makes a lot of sense to me. Like, mm-hmm. I've never seen sort of a foreign policy of restraint and a small c conservatism as opposed at all. Mm-hmm. If anything, the radicalism that you see from the Democratic Party, from the left, on a lot of those sort of domestic social issues and transgenderism and all that kind of stuff, I think pairs very nicely with a radicalism of exporting democracy to all ends of the earth and completely disregarding any sort of cultural considerations of those already there. So I'm not entirely surprised mm-hmm. that we're seeing this shift. And my hope is that there's something ideologically consistent about it that will make, the shift that I want, the right moving towards a more restrained foreign policy, actually stick in, post wherever we are now.
Mm-hmm. Going back over the history of the magazine, I mean, you guys have this wonderful book out that is Main Street Conservatism, The Future of the Right, which is a very, first of all, just it's great to be able to call that the title of your book when you're doing a retrospective. You've again, the timing is just so that the 20-year celebration is actually such. What are some of the pieces that were really important to you? Obviously, there were a lot of, historical considerations, categories and stuff that came into the writing of the volume. But what are the ones that really stand out to you as critical to the story of TAC?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I wanted to frame it as the future of the right, I wanted to be a little more ambitious than a collection for the sake of posterity. Mm-hmm. As I look back through the back catalog, I kind of mentioned these issues before, but it really seemed to me that we were prescient across foreign policy, political economy, what I broadly term American culture, which is basically immigration and defining and defending a uniquely American way of life, and faith and family. So that's the way that I wanted to group this anthology. If you look at, the specific pieces in there that completely stand out, there was a piece in 2007, I believe, mm-hmm. by Anatole Levin that made the case that pushing NATO expansion could force us into a new Cold War with Russia. 2007, right?
Much think.
Exactly. I know. I read that, and it was literally like it could have been written, a year ago.
Yeah.
And here we are in a really precarious situation with Russia and Ukraine. If you look at the Faith and Family section, it was really interesting to revisit some of the pre-Obergefell pieces on marriage. People forget,
People calling it a slippery slope, and the slope was indeed slippery.
Exactly. Like, this was a live political issue. It was winning at the ballot box, and then suddenly you have a Supreme Court come in and just completely shut that down, and all of corporate America jumps on it. It was really interesting to see some of the warnings that we have in there. Margaret McConnell, who's a lawyer here in town, talked about how if you redefine marriage, it's going to deny the ideal that no parent should abandon his child. And now we see things like renting wombs and surrogacy and all this kind of stuff. You can draw a straight line in my view. So yeah, if you look at, especially on the social conservatives issues, there's a number of pieces in there. Rod Dreher has a great piece about sex after Christianity, how this sexual revolution really is going to the heart of the Christian vision of the human person. So I could go on, but there's, each section I think has its own contributions to the magazine's history in the current moment.
What's it like when you're falling on deaf ears? Being able to go back and look in 2007 at a piece that was essentially prescient is fun now. But what has it been like to be the lonely voice, specifically on the issue of foreign policy, but certainly other issues as well, from a coalitional perspective? DC is a small town. It's a place where a lot of people know each other, and I see TAC as a co-sponsor and a partner on all sorts of events, and TAC people are invited to all the cool parties these days, certainly to ours. But that wasn't always the case. What are some of the stories you heard of what it's like to be someone in Washington writing pieces like that for TAC anytime but now? Well,
I think, one of the main things I've taken from looking back at this project is sort of a... What's always your riff that we're going to write essays
at each other until we all die?
Yes.
I will ask you about that, but yeah.
No, look, I take that criticism that too many people are doing that. But how did American Moment get founded? You read J.D. Vance's essay, right?
And J.D. Vance became a national figure because of a blog post that Rod Dreher wrote.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think these things can exist in tension. And what I realized, the more that I look back at us at this era when we were completely written out of the movement and not being invited to the parties and not co-sponsoring things and things like that, is that the ideas really do matter, and that middle brow magazines of ideas really have an impact and in a certain way define where the conservative movement goes. I think if you look historically, that's always been the case. You look at National Review in the 50s with Fusionism, Commentary and Neoconservatism. Obviously, the Weekly Standard, RIP, had a huge impact on the Bush White House. And I think that we're in a moment where we need a new middlebrow magazine of ideas. Obviously, I think that should be us. But no, that's been the big takeaway for me, is that, take your point about we need actual action too, which is why what you're doing in American Moment is so important. But these ideas do matter too. We need a forum to hash that out.
One of the issues that I think there's probably the most tension between what could be called old TAC and new TAC is potentially economics. It seems like on trade, there was basically kind of a consensus, but there's now a much more expanded vision of political economy that the faction of the right that we occupy is grappling with. What do you make of the criticism that, hey, this is in tension with all the realist libertarian types that were writing for the magazine back in the day that, yeah, maybe would be able to hold their nose on trade, but really don't like all this idea of a child benefit or family policy and all this other stuff?
I just think it depends on how you slice it, right? I'm not sure there's as much tension as it may appear. We've always welcomed a more heterodox conversation on economics. Obviously, the Buchananite protectionism is there. It has been from the beginning. That will continue to be there. We're also wary of economic heterodoxy trending too far towards planned economies and price controls and things like that. At the end of the day, to me, it comes down to priorities, right? Does the nation exist to serve the market, or does the market exist to serve the nation? It should be the latter. And we need to make sure that it's the latter. And that's why I've been open to things like family policy, like reshoring manufacturing, especially when you look at what's going on with Taiwan. We have to go economics first there. I think that goes perfectly with a foreign policy of restraint, right? Like, if you don't want to go to war to defend Taiwan, we sure as heck better be doing stuff economically to make it so that we're not overextended and that we have to defend Taiwan if an invasion happens. So yeah, I think, we want to host these types of debates. in my view, there's not quite as much tension as there might appear.
One of the interesting tensions between elite life in the United States and the population of voters has always been like it looks demographically a little bit different. And in the conservative movement, one of the most obvious examples of that, I think, is that there's a lot more intellectual Catholics at the upper echelons of the conservative movement than there are in the voting population of the right. The same could be said with TAC. TAC has a lot of Catholics and Orthodox people right now. Do you think that's a tension at all? Like the sort of small p populist vision of conservatism that you guys are advocating being so out of step with the religious practices of the country as they stand today?
I mean, as a Catholic, I think that the faith is true and everyone should convert to the one true faith. But I would say that I think, at least one of the things that motivates me, and I think this is consistent throughout Catholic political thought, is that there needs to be, this is one of my critiques of just sheer populism. I think, we can lament, there's no... Congress is overrepresented with people with college degrees. It's not representative of the country. I think a previous generation would have been like, of course that's the case. Like the college educated class is the class that belongs in Congress. It's just a different role within the polity. But I think that the what we need to realize as sort of the intellectual class, for lack of a better term, I don't like that, but for those of us who are working in politics, is there needs to be a much better sense of solidarity between the classes. I think that that's actually an insight that the sort of overwhelmingly Catholic representative of the conservative movement can actually really channel here. I think it's a very Catholic sense. We need to be representing the interests of our countrymen who are not here in Washington. So I guess I don't know if that answers your question, but I think at its best, a Catholic political class can and should do that.
What do you make in terms of any tension in political priorities that, say, very Catholic-minded people might have versus, say, the combination of evangelicals, softer Catholics, and nuns that make up the, that's N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, that make up the broad base of the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, it depends on which Catholics you're talking about, right? I mean, like, I don't see, you can point to something like immigration. I see no conflict between a Catholic politics and an extremely restricted immigration policy. I think it's better for those who are here. It's better for those who want to get here. So there's some intra-conservative or intra-Catholic fights that you can point to, but I don't see that much of a disconnect.
I'm simply giving voice to critics from the outside. I tend to agree with everything that you just said. The term paleoconservative gets thrown around a lot to the extent that there are representatives of paleoconservatism in the United States. It's probably Chronicles magazine and you guys. Does that term mean anything to you? Is it outdated? I don't see this magazine entitled The American Paleoconservative. Why is it not called that? And how do you think about adjectives and labels in this day and age?
I mean, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. I enjoy the intellectual debates. I fully recognize that this goes back decades, right? There's big differences when you talk about the genesis of the American regime, Lincoln's place in it between paleocons and Straussians and all that kind of stuff. There's intellectual differences between the paleoconservative school and our friends at the Claremont Institute. I think it's really interesting now that these sort of decades old intellectual fights have ended up with people basically in the same place. I mean, if you look at kind of the conservatism that we put forward on the issues, it's very similar to what the Straussians, the Claremont Institute are doing. So, I think that these intellectual debates are important. We have a whole fellows program where we try to hash that out and make the case for sort of more paleoconservative vision. But when you look at day-to-day politics, I'm not sure how salient those sort of prefixes to conservative are. If you're actually looking to move the ball forward on issue sets, like, let's work with people who agree with us 9 times out of 10.
On an interpersonal level, what's that been like to take inherited grudges and put them down for a while? I mean, I see Claremont staffers writing for TAC all the time. I see TAC people doing Claremont fellowships. I think I even saw that you guys are co-sponsoring an event with them. And golly gee, next time people will be wearing pants on their heads and stuff. I mean, what's it been like to be the generation, both at TAC but also more broadly in like paleocon world, that decides to put those old battles down?
I mean, I think it's an important thing to navigate, because I don't want to discount the importance of these intellectual disagreements. Like, there's a reason that a generation before us went to bat for these things. They really do matter. And I think if this was a different political moment, we might see the policies that stem from these intellectual disagreements be more different, right? So I think we need to be mindful of that.
If they weren't trying to trans your kids, then maybe we could have really eloquent discourses on Leo Strauss.
We need to realize what we're up against, you know? We need to realize that the left is the real threat here. And those of us who are willing to fight and have a more muscular conservatism need to work together. But that doesn't mean that these intellectual disputes are unimportant.
Well, and isn't the argument that, well, we need to all unite and fight the left what the political establishment says too? They don't really want to fight the left.
Yeah. I mean, come
on. Again, I'm giving you a hard time because it matters.
Yes.
Point well taken. In that case, then, what does the coalition today look like? The traditional answer to what does the elite level coalition on the right look like under Fusionists, under National Review, was social conservatives who get their social conservative issues, economic libertarians who get their issues, and foreign policy demented people who get their issues. What does the elite level coalition in a couple of buckets look like in your mind in the 2020s? Yeah,
it's a really good question, and it's something that we try to hash out a lot in the pages of the magazine. I think that it's, a lot of people talk about fusionism has failed, the three-legged stool has failed. Like, I'm sympathetic to a ton of that. But I think it's undeniable that we need to put something back together again. We need some form of coalition, call it fusionism, call it whatever you will, if we want to have an actually viable movement. And I always ask a lot of people around town, like, what puts you on the right? Because if you look at, again, the history of this magazine and even my own politics, especially a lot of the foreign policy stuff, even some of the economic stuff, a prior generation of conservatives would just say you're not a conservative, you're a lefty. And what it always comes back to, or what it seems like it always comes back to me when you say why you're on the right, is that they're just not okay with transing the kids. They're not okay with fundamentally transforming this country. It's people who genuinely like this country and its history and want it to basically stay the way that it is. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think especially as the left gets more radical, that's actually something that we can unite around, right? People who aggressively want to defend what's good about this country. We can tinker around the edges on a lot of stuff, but I think that sort of centering goes to a lot of these different issues that we've talked about.
What would you say to the kind of revolutionary ethos that a lot of people have on the right now, which is that we have lost so much that simply adopting the posture of conservation isn't good enough anymore?
I'm not quite there. Yeah. Again, like I read all those guys, I listen to all those guys, I like all those guys. I think that there's still enough left here. Now, look, we have a very short window of time. And I'm concerned with my own kids,
one election cycle, donate $3.42. I'm kidding.
Sounds like we're pitching for Tuesday in the midterms. Yeah. But I do think, this is to me why the immigration issue is so important. And why I mentioned before that it's not, the situation that we have now with the porous border is not good for either the people already here or the ones who want to come and join this country. And I think that's a message we have to really get across. If we don't do something about this soon, the America that we've all known and loved is not going to exist. It'll be fundamentally transformed. So yeah, I think there's still enough there that we can and should seek to conserve it. But yeah, to a lot of these more, there's nothing left to conserve people's point. Like, we don't have a lot of time left, or we will be at that point very quickly.
What would you say your posture is towards institutions, right? So maybe one of the biggest differences in the 20 intervening years since TAC was founded is that formerly patriotic institutions, or maybe a better way to put it is that institutions that were the sort of representativeness, the representatives of the best of what America had to offer have completely been like hollowed out from the inside and worn as a skin suit by our enemies, whether that's things like elite colleges, things like the government, the military,
the NFL. I'm a big football fan. The Redskins are no more. Right. It's ridiculous.
So like, to the extent that I'm sure that this piece has existed in almost every issue for the last 20 years of TAC, some sort of, kind of wispy, nostalgic overview of some sort of great bedrock of American life, whether it's a sports game or, X, Y, or Z thing. it seems like every single day the left takes some nice thing and says, that's cool, we're going to invert that from the inside. This is downstream of the institutional question, but how does a TAC reader and leader contend with the fact that all of the really cool institutions in American life are slowly getting ripped out one by one?
Rod got a lot of criticism, Rod Dreher, for his Benedict option.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's basically right.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that in the intervening years, that was published in 2017, so it's been like 5 years now. In the intervening years, even a lot of people who criticized him on the ideas there are basically doing the Benedict option with their families. I mean, I certainly am, right? Like, we can go back and forth about what is the Benedict option, that kind of stuff. My reading is that at its heart, it's the institutions are rotten to the core.
Mm-hmm.
They failed us. And if you want to actually raise your kids as healthy, virtuous people who love this country, you need to sort of strategically retreat from those institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And that can just mean sending your kids to parochial school or homeschool. I mean, my wife and I are doing this. We grew up together in Herndon, Virginia, and we both went to the same high school. It's right down the street from where we live now. Love my hometown and my community. I could never send my kids to that high school.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to send them to the Catholic school.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the Benedict option, sure, great. And that's a way to protect your family and your kids, the next generation,
Mm-hmm.
from these completely rotten institutions, while, we have people working to reform them and to use the levers of power to actually hopefully get to a place where you don't have to do that in the future, right? I think you've made this point that school choice is great, but like not everyone can do that. And it should be in the interest of conservatives and, patriotic Americans to have a public school system that doesn't suck and that you can actually send your kids to.
Well, and one of the honorees at your gala next week or 2 weeks from now is often, framing it as exactly this, that there is a fight to be had in our public schools, and we should not abandon it just because we want to champion school choice. Look, the yellow scarf people maybe make some good points, but like at some point, like they haven't managed to increase school choice all that much in the last 20 years, and we should really focus on some of the opportunities that exist in places like this. What do you make of the particular time that we're in right now, where it seems like a lot of things are up for grabs in terms of ideological paradigm shift? So we don't have a Republican president in office right now. We're probably going to have some presidential announcements in like the next 3 months is my guess.
I think Trump's just like waiting for the midterms.
Right. What do you think the opportunities and the risks are? Do you think the we're at risk of losing some of the gains we've made along these ideas from the Trump era? What would that look like? What would co-optation look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real risk, right? You've already seen this rhetorically a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's a realist now on foreign policy. That means really nobody is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But people have seen that rhetoric resonates.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something
everyone's an America First MAGA Republican.
Exactly.
Or an America First MAGA constitutional conservative Republican, like to give America First MAGA constitutional conservative Tea Party Republican, to put all the skin suits on at once. Yeah.
So it's something we absolutely have to be concerned about. This is, I think, the value of a magazine or a publication is it can really assess these things, because I think you're absolutely going to see the GOP primary in 24 have multiple people wanting to return to the pre-2016 consensus who are strategically adopting rhetoric from the Trump moment. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be up to the political class to call them out, right? It's going to be up to magazines who hopefully get it, publications who get it, to say no, they're not actually channeling the interests of the people.
I want to throw some media theory out here. So at the time when TAC was launched, it was basically on the eve of the internet era. It was already started kind of coming about. I'm assuming there were some early blogs and stuff. I don't think National Review's blog had launched yet, but it might have at that point. Why a magazine? Why is that the format to communicate with people? Obviously TAC has not been monistic in its outlook, because there is also a TAC weblog that I have contributed to a couple of times. How do you guys think about the format that you guys operate in, what its future and may hold?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at that. I mean, we have a print magazine still. I actually love the print magazine. I think it anchors our editorial process really well. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of our readership is online. Mm-hmm. I think it's just how it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And so you can look at it in that way, that like we are invested online and that a lot of our readership is there. But you can also look at it. I mean, we're both very online. We know that like the very online right is a thing. And I think a lot of those ideas are really important. When you look at, needing to reach a certain subset, I think there's a big need a lot of times to translate the more rough-edged, wild ideas that float around in the internet and distill that and sort of put forward something that...
there was a seed oil issue of the American Conservative.
Exactly. No, exactly. I mean, that stuff, that chatter does matter, right? But like someone needs to sort of translate that to something that, sits on coffee tables in congressional offices, right? I think that's a really important role to play. You have to sort of distill that down, pick what's too wild and fringy, pick what's actually, hitting on some important themes, and have a medium that can do that. And that's, a lot of what we hope to do. And that's why we have the print magazine. And that's, why we seek to be a sort of middlebrow magazine of ideas.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the pace that modern media operates at, and how an institution like TAC can adapt to that? I mean, at this point, we live in the era of Twitter.
It's so unhealthy. I mean, there's a part of me that's just like a complete tech pessimist, Wendellberry, want to move to the country and do my farming thing, which I know you absolutely hate.
Yeah.
But no, a lot of that comes out for me with social media, with the pace of the sort of 24-hour news cycle. I just think it's really unhealthy. It's unhealthy to living a life of virtue. It's unhealthy for our politics. Now it's a fact of life nowadays, and we have to contend with it. That's another reason I like the fact that we have print, because every 2 months, our editorial staff is forced to take a step back and say, okay, we have a definitive number of pages. Let's look at this current political moment in this season of this year. What do we think is the most important thing to say? What do we actually want to get out there? So, and again, all the print stuff goes online, but even just having that editorial mechanism in place, I think is actually really helpful to avoid some of the more poisonous elements of this horrible, social media catastrophe that we have.
Technology is an interesting thing because it's another one of the like fundamental elements of American society that's changed since TAC was launched to now. I mean, so many of the things that are different about the world around us today can be ascribed to technology. What does the paleocon or the American conservative, capital T, capital A, capital C, say about technology? Is it pure techno-pessimism? Speak for yourself, speak for the magazine. And I'm sure you've published many a line on it. But what is the what are the core tenets of the American conservative? It's family, peace, culture, and forgetting one more, but
economics.
You tell.
Yes.
Economics. That's right.
I'll just speak for myself because I think that I actually think that this debate of techno-optimism, techno-pessimism is one of the most important happening, not just on the right, but on the sort of like broad new right space. Ross Douthat had a column about this in the New York Times. I can't remember what it was like a year ago or so, where he kind of outlined these broad camps, right? The Silicon Valley techno-optimist side, the sort of crunchy-con, Dreyer, the techno-pessimist side. And I think that that's a really lively and super important debate that this segment of the right needs to have. Again, I find myself more on the techno-pessimist side. The older my kids get, the more I see that as well. I mean, that TV just rots their brains. I absolutely hate that. So I think tech can be harnessed for good. It is a tool. My concern, and I think part of why my sympathies tilt that way, is that we're not talking about, the internal combustion engine. We're talking about in your pocket computers that, completely rewire a lot of the way that we think and interact with people. And if we don't get a handle on that, I think it can have really bad effects for our society.
I want to spend the last third or so of our time talking about a kind of meta life of running an institution like this. One of the interesting things that happened to TAC over the course of its lifetime is it went from a for-profit publication to a nonprofit organization called the American Ideas Institute that publishes the American Conservative. I guess tying back to our earlier, tangent about the media landscape, why was that, broadly speaking, necessary? And, what do you make of the conservative nonprofit ecosystem today and what TAC's role in that is?
I mean, I think for publications, especially for these sort of niche magazines, it's absolutely necessary to go to that nonprofit model. You only need to point to the Weekly Standard to show why, right? They had a big corporate owner who decided that in the Trump era, a Trump skeptical magazine didn't serve any purpose, pulled the plug, and funded the Washington Examiner. We're very fortunate that we have a broad base of philanthropic support, which means that we can pursue our mission and sort of craft an editorial line that is true to that mission. So that was a key to our success, I think, over the last 10 years or so. We became a nonprofit, I think it was around 2010. But the other element of that too, right, is that it's just not, it's not possible to fund a magazine on subscriptions alone. So I think it's actually a really healthy part of the conservative movement. I think it's a healthy part of American society, right? I mean, there's a long history of civil society and philanthropy, people giving their money to causes they believe in. I see no reason that shouldn't be a political magazine.
You are one of the youngest nonprofit executives on the right. There's a club of us, I think, to be
You
made.
got me beat by a number of years.
Yeah. Well, I'm weird, but I have no business being here. What's frustrated you about how this world operates? Peel back the curtain a little bit. What's the world of conservative nonprofit philanthropy actually like behind the scenes, and coming into it as someone young with something to prove? What has annoyed the crap out of you?
Well, I always say that I don't think it's an accident that both myself and my staff is very young. Across the board, we're very young. Now that, we were founded 20 years ago by Pat Buchanan, who's not young at this point. I think it's his birthday today, by the way. Happy birthday, Pat.
Happy birthday, Pat. Yeah.
But I don't think it's an accident, because the ideas, the sort of brand of conservatism that we're trying to advance is one that really resonates with younger people. I mean, this is American Moment, right? I mean, this is why you guys are here. But as you might have found, that does cause some challenges, because the sort of donor class is much older. I mean, that's just the fact of it. And they also have relationships that have been built up for years, decades now, right? So philanthropy is based on relationships. People give to people more than they give to organizations and causes. And if you have, become really close with the head of an organization, if you're the head of a foundation, a conservative foundation, you've gotten really close to the head of an organization over 20, 30 years, it matters a lot less whether the work that they're doing is relevant than it does that, like, that's the guy that you've known for 30 years and you like him and you think he's doing good work. So I think that is a challenge. Now, fortunately, one, people like to reach the next generation. People like to say, is what I'm doing, is my giving going to actually turn this country around? So if they see that a lot of young people are involved, a lot of young people are leading the organization, that can help. And also the ideas are with us, I think, right? I mean, this is the moment for this style of conservatism.
I love having an organization title that can be slipped into sentences that easily. The riff on the interests of the donor class are interesting. What have you seen change about your median conservative donor in terms of their worldview over the last few years?
I mean, this goes a little bit back to what I said before about just sort of having a vague sense of liking this country and wanting it to stay the same. I actually think, despite my last answer, I think that the conservative donor class actually gets somewhat of a bad rap in our circles. Most of these people are hardworking, patriotic Americans who worked hard during their whole life and now have money to generously give away. And one of the things that's been encouraging in the Trump moment is I think the Trump campaign, the Trump presidency, sort of made a lot of this donor class realize that, like, there was a disconnect between their giving and what was happening in Washington. So I do think that presents an opportunity now. I don't think they're very ideological, right? I think that they simply love this country and want to save it. And that's great. That's where I'm at too.
What do you think their biases are, being older people on the ideological side? And, you mentioned the interpersonal relationships that they may have with their legacy grantees. But beyond that, what do you think their limitations are as a class?
I mean, I think, there's less of a sense of urgency, I think. And look, especially on this foreign policy issue, like, there's more residual Reaganism of peace through strength.
Yeah.
But
Russia bad.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So
which
there are,
but again.
this is the challenge and the opportunity in the sense that, like, I actually agree with a lot of that.
Yeah.
It needs to be channeled in the right direction. Like, shouldn't have invaded. We should have a strong national defense. Just needs to be used selectively. So again, there are things to navigate there, but it's also a big opportunity to, actually show the donor class that there are good things happening that they can also support.
Do you have any funny reactions from longtime subscribers or donors to the seed oils issue? Was that too avant-garde for them? How did they?
Most of it was, what the heck is that? My wife is still not on board with that. I've been trying to steer her away from the vegetable oils and stuff.
You keep stealing the Crisco and throwing it out back.
Yeah, no, but like literally, I got her to get like coconut oil or something the other day. I don't even know what it was. Yeah. She was not pleased about that. But right, no, that's a good example that, like,
Biden's inflation and you're trying to put coconut oil in the house on top of that.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah, it's a luxury good.
Yeah. What do you make of what do you think those avant-garde issues are that are likely to become more salient that TAC hopes to be able to feature in the coming months and years?
The very first one comes to mind. Tucker's End of Men documentary. Did you see that?
I have not seen it yet, but I want to.
There's some wild stuff in there. And
will there be a TAC issue on tanning your balls?
We're going to steer clear of that. But the plight of men, I think, is a really underreported, under-talked about thing in this country. I take it back to my family. I've 3 daughters now. I talked a big game before I got married that I was like going to have all boys because I can't handle daughters. So
yeah,
of course,
you and Nick both.
Yeah, no, of course God's like, here's 3 daughters, and probably on my way to 7. But I think about like who they're going to marry, right? Like, I mean, if I ever let them out of the house onto a date, I'd want them to meet and marry like a man, right? Yeah. Like a real, like, American man. Yeah. And I think that's the challenges that men face are much higher. So I think that needs to be explored a lot more. Obviously, the manosphere and all those very online places are getting way ahead on that. But I think that the mainstream conversation is very ripe for that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think this is another great example of where maybe legacy social conservatives actually aren't super up to the task, right? You think about the framing that a lot of them bring to the table on gender issues. It's often with very much the same sort of like moral lens as the left. It's always like, well, X, Y, and Z is bad because it's actually the worst thing for women, or it's actually not feminist enough, or it's actually letting men off the hook, when in reality there's been no attention broadly in politics and public policy on, is something good for men?
I really think we need to break out of that frame that the left operates in. Like, the minute you get sucked into that,
Dems are the real sexist, Dems are the real racist, Dems are the real XYZs.
And especially on the gender issues, right? Like, we should be able to say men and women are different. They serve different, equally important roles within our society. And as conservatives, we should encourage women to be women and men to be men. And stop with this whole, actually X thing that I hate is bad because it's bad for women or whatever it is. I think that's such an important rhetorical shift that needs to happen like yesterday.
One of the other interesting changes in the global landscape since TAC was launched is that I think arguably at TAC's founding, there was basically like one game in town, the US. And now there's like examples of places where interesting experiments in what could be called paleoconservative governance are happening. How do you think about that side of things, being more internationalist in your conservative politics and paying attention?
You basically mean Hungary?
No, but like beyond that, right? I mean, there's interesting stuff happening everywhere from Hungary to Israel to India to Brazil to, and a bunch of other places beyond that. What does TAC make of all that?
I watch it with great interest. Yeah. I mean, we've obviously, especially on the Hungarian one, we've written a lot about what's going on there. I always, I think, largely supportive of a lot of this stuff. I do think that we need to remember that this country is unique. This country is different from Hungary for sure. It's different from Brazil. It's different from all these places. And what works there very well might not work here. I mean, I just think this country is just too big, this is why at my heart, I'm somewhat of a localist. Like, I'm a Virginian. Virginia's about the same.
What does that mean?
That means that
what is Virginian political identity in the 21st century?
Oh, that's right. No, but I think, look, it's somewhat more aspirational than it is, concrete at this point. But I think one of the problems with a country of 330 million people, and we see this throughout the right, is that your national identity becomes an abstraction. It becomes my allegiance to this American idea. And that's, I think, really dangerous for a whole number of reasons. Instead, we should derive our patriotism from the concrete relationships and practices and experiences that order the rhythms of our life in a concrete way in our local places, right? I always say that, like, I'm a proud American because of my attachments in Herndon, Virginia. Like, I'm an American through that. I think especially in a country this big, we really need to stay rooted in those concrete sort of attachments rather than just, latching on to the American idea, which is just a complete abstraction.
You mentioned earlier that TAC is in the middle of sort of a paradigm shift where it's going from the opposition to the mainstream to becoming more and more the mainstream. I tend to agree with that. Practically speaking, for the magazine, for its attitude, for the institution more broadly, what does that mean changing in terms of its behavior to politics, to DC, to the entire country?
No, it's actually a really big challenge. During the Bush years, we developed pretty sharp elbows because we were getting attacked from every single side, which I think totally makes sense, right? Like when you're...
Everyone I don't like is a communist.
Right, yeah. I mean, when you're getting attacked like that, you're going to be very critical. Yes. And so one of the sort of dispositional shifts that needs to happen, that I've been trying to make happen, is just understanding that the tent's a little bit bigger, right? We might disagree with people here and there on things. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have a very narrow lane on the right anymore. We need to bring these people along rather than show everyone else on the right how they're wrong and we're right. So I don't see this intention with, watering down our distinct ideological approach, our distinct editorial line. I think it's just an awareness now that people are much more open to it. So we need to have less sharp elbows than we might have had before.
When the 30th anniversary issue of TAC comes out, what are going to be the pieces written this coming decade that you think are going to be reflected on? And I recognize that's a weird question to ask, but I suppose it's just an extension.
Depends on what happens this decade.
Well, but I suppose it's an extension of, imputing, like you did with the piece about American men. What do you think the salient political issues that TAC's going to be right on and the rest of the conservative movement's going to be wrong on are this decade?
My hope is that we are right on those issues and the conservative movement is right because we've all gotten
succeeded.
Exactly. No, it's a good question. Look, I think there's really two tracks here. There's a foreign policy track and a domestic track. Domestically, we have to do something to stop the just steamrolling social liberalism. I mean, who would have thought in 2012, when I think Obama at that point was still against gay marriage, that we would have twerking drag queens in our schools, right? Like, I shudder to think where that's going to be if we don't do our jobs right. Now, I'm hopeful because we're starting to see some people push back on this, but we need to keep moving in that direction. On the foreign policy side, I think that the China challenge is going to be central to really this century. And it presents, again, both challenges and opportunities to those who want to see a more restrained foreign policy. You talked earlier about how do we know if people are going to co-opt sort of, this political moment. I am very concerned about that with China because it's a different challenge that may require more realism than restraint to the extent that they're opposed, and I'm not entirely sure that they are. But it is a real threat, right? In ways that I think, Syria and Libya, like whatever. China is a real threat to this country. And so getting that right and avoiding a sort of civilizational conflict with a rising China, I think
you're telling me that
really
TAC
tough.
will never do the classic, dragon encircling the world style middle to highbrow magazine thing.
This is the problem, though, right? Is that I think you have many unreformed hawks on the right who see the failures in the Middle East, see that that's sort of,
There's not a lot of cachet left.
There's not a lot there.
Their Arabic degree is really not any good anymore.
Exactly. So they're like, all right, well, whatever. We can pivot now to China and just
I'm going to learn what Wolf Warrior means
going.
and suddenly be a China guy.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a real problem that we have to face. And it's even trickier too, because again, unlike those backwater countries in the Middle East, China is a real threat. Mm-hmm. So we kind of have to balance those two things.
Mm-hmm. And then on the domestic side, taking over social liberalism, stopping its tide, fine. But what does the other suite of domestic policy issues actually look like, and where the fight's going to be on the right?
Well, I mean, I do think that a lot of them are connected, right? Mm-hmm. Like the plight of men, the fact that we have schools that are basically parenting the kids instead of the families. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's connected to men not being able to find jobs, right, and provide for their families. So we need to build a more robust pro-family mm-hmm. economy. One of the things I like most about Blake Masters is that he had the courage to say that you should be able to raise a family on one single income. Mm-hmm. Why have no other Republican politicians been saying that? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you want to have an actual, tight-knit pro-family community, then you need families to be able to both support themselves mm-hmm. and also, support their children. Mm-hmm. I see, my wife has a harder job than I do. She's looking after our 3 kids. That's a much harder job than mm-hmm. going on a podcast and talking. So we really need to rebuild an American economy that provides that kind of work. Mm-hmm. But I see all of these things connected to just creating a country where you can just live a virtuous life in the place that you were born. That shouldn't be that hard. Mm-hmm. But I think that to the extent that we have not focused on that is the extent that we've gotten away from it, and it can't happen anymore.
Mm-hmm. If there was one piece that you would say best captures the American conservatives' style that no one else would publish, what would you say it is?
Our style?
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I like
What's the weirdest thing you guys have published? That's really what I'm getting
at. Where to start? I will give a plug to longtime columnist Bill Kaufman. He has a long and storied career, stints here in Washington, I believe on the Democratic side of the aisle for a while, and great writer, one of the best sort of prose essayists in my view, writing in America today. He's also a foremost defender of local life, which is why I like to give him a shout out. He's mm-hmm. a proud native of Batavia, New York, I believe it is. Mm-hmm. And every time he files a piece for every issue, it's the first thing I read because it's always just eclectic. Mm-hmm. He had one in the last issue about the sociologist Robert Nisbet, who I think is one of the forgotten champions of our sort of brand.
Yeah, one of your donor clubs is called the
Exactly. It paired very nicely. I had the Nisbet piece, and then there was a plug for the Nisbet Society on the next page. So yeah, I mean, look, we have been an eclectic magazine throughout our history, especially because we were sort of not in the sort of mainstream of the right. And I would just encourage everyone to go check out Bill Kaufman's back catalog because it's fantastic.
Very cool. Emil, where can people pay attention to everything TAC is doing? I think you have an event coming up. I want to give you a chance to plug that. What should they be keeping their eyes out for? Tell us all about it.
Yeah, we got a lot going on. TheAmericanConservative.com. You can find all of our new content up there. A little bit. That's
How much would TAC.com cost?
we'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You'll find everything there. If you want to get more involved, become a member. We're really trying to grow our membership base. We talked about the business model. That's hugely helpful for that. Mm-hmm. You also get special perks and things like that. So check all that out at the website, on Twitter @AmConMag. And then, yes, as you mentioned, we're celebrating 20 years this year. So November 17th, we have our big 20th anniversary celebration. Should be a great event in Alexandria, Virginia, Red State, Virginia. That's why we're doing it over there. Dan Bishop, who's become a leader on all of our issues. And we're also going to honor Chris Rufo and former Senator Jim Webb with awards. So we'll, have all that information on the website as well.
It's going to be a party, and we'll be there.
Yes.
Emil, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Glad that you guys stayed till the end for that, because there might be a special treat for you if you listened all the way to the end. If you're a dedicated listener to this podcast, then we actually have a discount code for listeners of Moment of Truth and friends of American Moment. If you email podcast@americanmoment.org and you're not weird, chances are we might give you that discount code. But even if you don't end up taking them up on that, be sure to go to the American Conservatives Gala here on November 17th. We are co-sponsoring it. Be sure to check out everything else that American Moment has cooking. Go to our website, americanmoment.org. There you can find the backlog of this podcast, news, updates about programs we're doing. I believe there'll be a couple of new program applications launching very shortly. They may even be up by now. And you can also rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, like and subscribe on YouTube. It really does help us in the algorithms. It helps us make sure that we can keep putting this podcast out. We're going full steam through the end of the year. Some awesome guests and getting ready for season 3 of Moment of Truth, which will be even better. It only goes up from here, as who was it? Kimberly Guilfoyle said, the best is yet to come. So thank you guys as always for listening. Week in and week out, you guys always show up. Thank you for being the Moment of Truth faithful, and thank you as always for tuning in. We will see you guys next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production, filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to americanmoment.org to learn more.